national security, and human rights. The public narratives of recent migration situation in the country mostly focuses on national security rather than the risks to life of those who have fled and potential human rights violations. Limited access to information, both for NGOs and journalists, even more complicates the situation that we have. All about these issues, we will talk with our invited speakers who have extensive experience in migration journalism, as well as in migration and humanitarian situation in origin countries. So I would like to welcome Robert McNeil, the Deputy Director and Head of Media and Communication at the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. Daniel Holden, Managing Director at Lighthouse Reports for Netherlands. And Eitvydas Bingelis, the Head of Office at International Organization for Migration, Vilnius office. In the name of the Diversity Development Group, I would like to express my gratitude for Rob McNeil, who cooperated for organizing this event, and also Media Migration Europe for sharing their expertise and ideas. During all presentations, you are able to leave your comments in the chat box, questions that you would like to ask for our speakers, and they will respond them during the Q&A session after all presentations. The ones who are watching the live stream on Facebook, you can also leave your comments there as well, and we will ask the speakers your questions as well here. So I would like to start the discussion, and I would like to invite Eitvydas Bingelis, who will present the results of rapid profiling of migrants in Lithuania arriving from Belarus, in order to understand a little bit more context that we have here in the country. So Eitvydas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Giedre. Hello to everyone. Yeah, so it's an honor for me to participate here, introduce a bit of information, maybe to give more clear or better view on the migrant situation in Lithuania. I am here in Vilnius, in Lithuania, made, as we call it, rapid profiling is under the IAM's so-called DTM, Displaced Tracking Metrics. It's part of a very huge expertise field that we have on collecting data on migrants and to help for governments, NGOs, and other players to make proper policy decisions with the migrant flows. What I also would like to highlight that this rapid profiling, it was not full profiling. It was just to get the first, let's say, sense, first look on the migrant picture here in Lithuania. If we want to have much concrete or more representative profiling, we need to continue doing that together with our partners. The profiling was made in August, so these numbers are from that period, and I just would like to share for you what we made now. I will share my screen. I hope you can see it. So anyone who after this conference would like to find the information, you can go to our webpage iam.lt. Go to this IAM profiling report. Here you can find the full mission report. It's also available in English and Lithuanian, and there we made an infogram that we try to put the most relevant or most important highlights from all the profiling. So profiling was made in 6 centers. Over 100 respondents participated in it voluntarily and anonymously. Average median age is 28 years old. Most of the participants who participated was from Iraq, Sri Lanka, and Syria. And there are some numbers, maybe ideas that I would like also to share. First of all, about when we are talking about employment status in their country, a lot of them more than half of them, they had some kind of activity. 15% were studying, 32 were employed, 11 was self-employed. But a huge number was 42 unemployed. In this number, I would like to also highlight that majority of this 42% were women, which is quite also typical in that part of the region, that they are typically more involved, let's say, in household activities. About education, also what we would like to also to share, that the education status also quite interesting, that 24% of all migrants had only primary education, 46 had the secondary education, only 20% they had a college, university, and 10% out of them, they have no formal education. Also, what I would like also to highlight in the context of COVID, which we have, that more than 60% of migrants agrees to be vaccinated, and a lot of them, they will offer to get vaccine. And I think that it's also very important to to prevent any kind of escalation of COVID, especially in migrant places. Main reasons people highlighted during this profiling, the reasons why they left their countries of origin was violence and persecution. More than half of them identified it. Even 14%, almost 15, they straightforward highlighted that this is economic reasons that they're traveling to Europe. Also war and conflict, and also additional things like limited access to the services, environment reason, and seeking for education. And also maybe I would like to highlight this environment reason. It also talks about climate change and these kind of things. And I think when we are talking about maybe future flows of migration, in the end, I think after 10 years or something like that, the environment and climate change will also have much bigger impact on migrant flows. About main traveling routes, we have quite interesting situation which we found. One part is there is a number of countries like people from Sri Lanka. They were traveling to Russia, and from Russia by car, by truck, they were coming to Belarus, and from Belarus crossing Lithuanian border. We also, one of respondents who participated in this, he received even international protection from Syria, if I'm correct, in Russia, and he was not satisfied with the conditions up there, and he learned about new pathway to cross the Europe, and he then decided to travel to Belarus and then to Lithuania. A lot of Iraqis, they came for direct flights to Minsk and then trying to cross the border, and also the majority of population who came from Africa, they were traveling via Istanbul. 16% of them identified that they crossed the border of Lithuania and Belarus by car, by truck, and 84% they did by walking. More about the migrants. 6 out of 10 stated their social economic situation in country of origin was being fair or good. So they identified that not only the economical social status was a bad one. About money they spent during this journey. About 17% they spent less than 1,000 euros, 16% spent between 1,000 and 2,500 euros. About 19% spent between 2,500 and 5,000 euros. 30% spent more than 5,000 euros to come to Lithuania. 15% of them, they was not open to share this kind of information. The reasons why migrants choose to come to Lithuania, it was also quite interesting part that they had some kind of, let's say, rumors about migration or asylum procedures in Lithuania. They were misinformed about the procedures, that even for Lithuania, it's very useful that they are traveling via Lithuania because, for example, they're getting additional funding from European Union and they're getting better conditions. So even that in Lithuania government is encouraging that. So this kind of misinformation encouraged them to choose this pathway. also a lot of them, in my opinion, 21%, they were seeking to join their families in other EU countries. It's mostly Germany and Scandinavian countries. 25% identified that they just, it's coincidence that they're in Lithuania and they were not aware, maybe in this case, that this was the country they will be crossing. About destination country, a lot of migrants, 51%, they identified their one of, let's say, their destination country is Lithuania. But what we understood from this interviews with them, that a lot of them, they are saying that because they think that they would have a positive procedure on their asylum requests. So I would say that other countries who are identified by migrants, like Germany, United Kingdom, are one of the countries that they would be willing to go. And another thing that about 38% knew about Assist Volunteer Return Reintegration Program in Lithuania, that they can use any kind of support from the state, from IAM, to help for them to come back to their countries of origin. But another thing which is also quite important, especially in the numbers of August, that none of the respondents considering to come back to their country of origin. So there would be, I would stop here. There would, if you have any further questions, I think I can answer later on. And also much more details you can find on our webpage and full profiling on full report. So thank you. Back to you, Giedre.
Thank you. It was very interesting. I really recommend to go into the report and to look a little bit more deeper into the details. Now I'd like to invite Robert McNeil to talk about how to engage with the narratives of securitization, because at the beginning, as I mentioned, that currently what we have, especially from a political narratives, that we are mainly focusing on national security, forgetting the perspective of human rights. So, Robert, it will be very interesting to hear your vision. Thank you.
Well, so thank you very much to all of you for inviting me to speak here today. I think that the key point that I wanted to make about all of this was that in the research that I've done looking at journalistic practices in reporting migration, it's very clear that one thing sits underneath pretty much all journalists' experiences of reporting the subject, which is a desire to actually do something good for society. And I mean, as a former journalist myself, I can completely associate with that, and I do understand that. The complexity of this is the question of how one does something good for society, and what it is that one needs to actually engage with in order to make the world a better place, which is a kind of the way that an awful lot of journalists described to me when we were interviewing them about their practices, the objectives that they had with their work. Now, the challenge here is that this is something which can be used against journalism as well. And it can be used in order to, because there are often conflicting ideas of what it means to make the world a better place. And so within the context of a kind of a national narrative about incoming groups, particularly poor or unknown vulnerable groups, one tends to have discussion about what a threat this becomes for that national group. And I'm really, my kind of primary objective is to sort of engage with the journalists who are on this call, and also those who are kind of dealing with the narratives in Lithuania about this, to highlight the fact that by engaging purely with the idea of national threat, one potentially falls into a trap of being maneuvered into a situation where one ends up serving effectively the kind of the strategic purposes of even hostile actors. And we've seen repeatedly over the last 5 or 10 years the use specifically of migration as a tool to try and kind of ram home aggressive populist politics in a number of different countries. Now, my own personal experience of this comes from obviously the Brexit debate in the UK, though we've seen it in a number of different ways in a number of different places. And thinking about the implications of what reporting on migration from a point of view which is purely based on, well, you know, we should protect our own interests rather than looking at a broader picture and what it means to protect those interests actually looks like. One can be used quite easily as a journalist in essentially the kind of the processes of other forces. So my first point is to highlight that one needs to think about what is happening, why it's happening, and the underlying causes and drivers. Now, within the context of asylum seeking, I think it's extremely important to recognise that obviously a lot of people are fleeing persecution, they are fleeing genuine threat to life, and that one needs to assess. But you know, in order to be a nation which actually delivers on a kind of which has some sort of moral standing in the world, one has to recognise that you have to take this seriously. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that one ignores security questions. One has to do assessment processes with asylum seekers, with refugees, make sure that these people are actually, you know, who they say they are, make sure that they don't represent a threat to society. But every European country has systems in place to make sure that that kind of thing can be done. And there's no particular reason to imagine that it wouldn't be. So from that point of view, I think that it's very important to remember that the starting point of all of this has to be the humanity of the individuals. Now, I would actually highlight quickly that for those of you who are working journalists, myself and a colleague of mine, Tom Law, from the who's formerly at the Ethical Journalism Network and now at the Global Forum for Media Development, have written a book about actually how to engage with the issue of migration generally. So, but that first point, recognizing the humanity of the individuals, the potential threat to their own lives, that is really critical. Now, it's also blindingly obvious. And actually, from the point of view of those of you whose audiences are domestic and who are concerned about domestic politics issues, I would say, well, it's legitimate, of course, to think about the domestic questions. Of course it is. It's fundamental to think about those domestic questions. But if you're thinking about those domestic questions from the point of view purely of dealing with the immediate knee-jerk reaction of public opinion to a small number of arrivals, you are potentially in a situation where you may be used in order to push a narrative which benefits another, as I say, a hostile government or a particular political perspective on the issue of migration or on issues more broadly. And in this context, I think it's really, really important to recognise the use of misinformation, which we've seen repeatedly within countries, particularly within Russia, but also within a number of other countries, where specifically migrants have been weaponised as tools to encourage essentially societal concerns in countries such as the UK, the US, and in Western Europe, and have been effectively instrumentalized in such a way as weapons of a sort of hybrid warfare. Now, I think that if one participates in reporting which facilitates that kind of strategic benefit, so one actually helps to whip up public concerns about these issues, rather than saying, well, actually, there are some people here that we need to look after, that need to be dealt with reasonably. And of course, we need to have a unified response to how we deal with this with our neighbours, and we need to be realistic about this kind of thing. But when you have a relatively small number of people arriving, which can be dealt with reasonably well, it may be a new flow, such as the flow into Lithuania and into other Baltic states from Belarus. It doesn't mean that one needs to freak out about this kind of thing. And I think that by doing so, one can find oneself in a very, very problematic situation where one feeds the benefit, where one benefits essentially these potentially hostile actors, which drives more of a desire to facilitate flows of people through these routes, which then potentially creates a bigger problem in the longer term. So I think that one has to think about that. It's very important. So, I mean, finally, I would just wrap up and say, I'm going to share a link in the chat to the handbook that myself and Tom have written, I would highlight as well that this does not tell you that you have to report on migration in a particular way. It doesn't say that you have to have a particularly liberal perspective. It doesn't tell you you have to have a particularly conservative perspective. It's simply there to help to make sure that certain ways of framing things, which are used sometimes by problematic actors to engineer the consent of people to a particular perspective on things, can be avoided, and that you can think through the fundamentals and the fundamental issues that sit underneath the issue of migration. Because this is a tool that has been used for propaganda for centuries, millennia even, in order to try to whip up public sentiment in particular ways. So basically what I'm saying is, don't fall into the trap of being a tool for other people. You can, I mean, quality reporting on the issue of migration, of course, can uncover scandals, it can uncover smuggling, it can uncover problems left, right, and center, and that's fine. But do it in a way which recognizes the humanity of the individuals, and where you're not allowing yourself to be maneuvered into a way of reporting on these issues, which is driven by somebody else's agenda. Okay, so I'm going to share that link in the chat in a minute, and I'm happy to answer questions. I know that was a bit of a broad thematic chat, but happy to answer any questions later on.
Thank you, Rob, for sharing your experience. And our final speaker today is Daniel Holden, who would share his experience relevant to Lithuanian NGOs and also representatives of mass media, responding to pushbacks and seeking the ways to document them, advocate around this issue, and also respond to securitization narratives. So, Daniel, the floor is yours.
Hello, sorry about that. I had a couple of quick problems with my connection on this side. Can everyone hear me okay now?
Perfect. Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much. Okay, well, I think the first thing to say from our side, I'll give a very brief introduction to Lighthouse. So we are what's commonly known in the US context as a non-profit newsroom. We work with existing platforms, so this is newspapers, websites, television stations, to help them pursue more complex investigations. So we have our own team that provides certain things which don't exist in most average newsrooms. So an open source investigator, or a data scientist, or maybe a financial investigator. So that's just a quick introduction to Lighthouse reports. I'm going to take people back in time now to March of 2020, when events at the Greek-Turkish border and the language that was used around that and the way in which those events were described would be extremely familiar to anyone in Lithuania or in Poland today. You had a situation in which the neighboring country just beyond the EU's external frontiers, in this case Turkey, declared that it was going to be changing policy and it was going to be facilitating. I mean, the language was more dramatic than that, but it would be opening the gates to Europe. You then had a major escalation of military presence on both sides of the Greek-Turkish border, and alongside what became quite a tense standoff with at the very least several thousand non-Turkish citizens, non-Turks collected at the border at the land border with Greece. You had a significant increase in the Greek military presence, the closure of the border, and a declaration that the asylum system, Europe's asylum system, would be suspended in Greece for an unknown period. On the one side, you had Turkey complaining that it had been hosting millions of refugees for an extended period of time, and that it could no longer do so, and that it would finally relax its controls on internal movement in Turkey, and that Europe would have to deal with this problem. On the Greek side, this was perceived as essentially as an act of war. The Greek government and much of the media came out and said that Greece was now in a state of hybrid war with Turkey, and that the migrants themselves were weapons in this hybrid war. While this was going on, you had on a regular basis, day to day, short videos that were going viral that claimed to show Turkish forces cooperating with young migrant men in trying to attack fences. There were videos that claimed to show people putting smoke bombs close to babies and making them cry, and for the cameras. So there was a fairly, pretty much every day while this crisis was going on, you had viral imagery that was driving news coverage with very little verification. So what we saw as Lighthouse was a high misinformation, disinformation climate with state and non-state actors. It's hard to remember now post-COVID, but briefly this was the biggest story in the world. Journalists converged on the border. We were having conversations about whether we were back in 2015, whether this was, whether Europe could exert control over its borders, or would we have 1 million people marching into Europe. So this was the general context. This is an extremely hard environment for journalists to do any basic truth telling, any verification of facts. So I'm going to talk you through a little bit some of our responses to that and illustrate it with a few of the investigations that came out. Let me just see if I can get my screen sharing up. So the first thing to say is that Lighthouse is not, we're not ourselves a publishing platform. So what I'm going to eventually put up here is how we write about the investigations that we conduct. The main products of these investigations appear in existing media. So we see here Pushbacks, Chapter 1. I'm assuming that everybody can see that. These were a series of investigations that we conducted with The Guardian, with our newspaper in the Netherlands, Deutsche Welle in Germany, with Bellingcat. And the aim of the exercise here was to take the tools that we had at our disposal and actually establish some solid facts about what was going on. So in the context of the crisis that I've just described, we started to get reports that the people who had crossed the border and had made a claim for asylum and had sought international protection were being pushed back against their will across the border. And that not only this, but that people who had been residents and were at some stage in their asylum process had been present in Greece for longer periods of time, up to 18 months or 6 months. They were also essentially being kidnapped outside of reception centers in places like Thessaloniki, and after arriving on the islands and after having reported themselves to the police. So there were these illegal pushbacks, or what came to be called in the media deep pushbacks, going on. What we were able to do in this case is to use visual evidence, so digital trails that accumulated from the places that people were moving. And I'll pick out a particular example from here. The story that I'm about to show from Bashar, who's our open source investigator, was the first minutely detailed and evidenced account of an instance in which a group of 39 people had landed on Samos, which is a Greek island, had sought asylum, had reported their presence to the authorities, and had been detained, refused asylum, put onto life rafts, towed out to sea, and then pushed towards the Turkish side. We were able to create a digital chain of evidence that demonstrated that we could prove who these people were. We were able to gather imagery of them on the boat on the way over. Essentially, these were Facebook live streams, so they were timestamped digital footage that showed the group of people on their way towards Samos. But then we were able to geolocate these images and prove that this was in fact Samos that we could see in the background of the images. We then established the presence of the same group on Samos. These are timestamped images. We're able to geolocate them. We can identify the people who are in the images, identify key landmarks that were there. So we can prove that these people did depart. They left, they went to Samos, they got to Samos. We know that they were there in order to claim asylum. We have message exchanges that went on at the time. So we could provide an entire timeline of these guys going there, doing this, and then being detained, ultimately picked up, pushed back. The final image that we see here is the same people who've been dumped, who've basically been dumped on an islet off of Turkey and are being picked up by the Turkish Coast Guard. This is the boat. These were images from Samos. We can show the boat that they arrived in. So what we had was a situation where there was a digital trail that we could follow. In all previous incidents where there were accusations of pushbacks, there were just verbal accounts. There were people who were interviewed either back in Turkey or at another location at a later stage who could talk through what they said had happened to them. So you had verbal testimony from people who claimed that they'd been pushed back and official denials. What we're able to do with visual evidence in this case was to demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that these people had been present and that their accounts of the chain of events could be verified, right down to kind of seemingly small and irrelevant details, like a pack of nappies that could only have been bought in Turkey being found on the beach in Samos right next to the same boat. We knew where people had been and how it had worked. So this kind of painstaking work, this has laid the ground for then further coverage in Deutsche Welle, in the Wall Street Journal, and then in practically every major media across the world has by now done a story on land or sea pushbacks in Greece. This kind of approach also enabled us to follow a more complex and a more heated account, which was an individual incident where shots were fired and at least one person was reported dead at the border. And we were able to work with a consortium of forensic architecture, Der Spiegel, Bellingcat, Sky News, and basically take some of the same techniques to collect multiple social media and digital shreds of evidence and then stitch those together into a single sequence that enabled us to say beyond any reasonable doubt that the responsibility for the shooting of the guy that died, Mohammed Gulzar, on the Greek side and with the Greek forces. For those of you who'd like to look at this in a bit more detail, I would recommend going to the, let me just bring this up here, sorry. I would recommend if you go to Lighthouse's site, go back through our investigations. In each of these, you will see there's numerous investigations related to pushbacks, but we also talk you through the methodology and explain how this reporting was done, how we enabled the partners, how evidence was collected, etc. It's the best thing to do in terms of in terms of the goals, one is to go and see the short film that was put together on the forensic architecture site. But there was also there were long reads and television packages put together for Sky News. So you can see, and the same with the Spiegel. I won't take you through all of that now, given the time constraints that we have. But I'd be happy to drop the link to Lighthouse into the chat, so that everybody can. Sorry, 1 second. I'll just put this for everyone, and they can take their own look through the pushback evidence and the investigation write-ups. What I would say is you have to confront the complexity of this issue. One of the investigations that we did as part of the same family of investigations looked at the way in which people's movements, groups of migrants' movements at the border and the border areas had been manipulated on the Turkish side. So the tools that you're going to use to interrogate the behavior of a European government, you also then need to use some of the same tools to examine how the situation is being manipulated immediately beyond the borders as well. We did do some verification of individual videos where we debunked some of the claims that were being made about what was being shown. As quickly as you can do that, it's very, very hard to attract anything like the same scale of audience for that kind of work as the original. So this viral video, which seemed to show tear gas being put next to children in order to make them cry for the cameras of international media, this was a completely fake version of what had happened. And we were able to demonstrate this, and we confronted all of the media that had run the faked video or the manipulated video. But the audience were able to get that. So those debunking exercises are tiny in comparison with the number of people who saw the original inflammatory coverage of this. So you can expend a lot of energy trying to live debunk popular viral videos right there at the time. What we found worked better was to take on some of the central events that were being actively denied at the time and establish a digital chain of evidence as to what had happened. Once you've done that groundwork, it makes it possible for a lot of other journalists to follow through, and you give them the evidence that they need to build their own stories out of this. And we found that coverage so there were already thousands of testimonies from the border areas speaking to illegal pushbacks, violence against people in the border areas. That had never really cut through and forced a response from the governments in question, and it never led to any significant follow-up investigations. In the space of a few months of using these kinds of digital techniques, we were able to get a significant proportion of the European Parliament to sign up to letters demanding investigations. We then followed up and were able to use some of these same techniques alongside ship and aircraft tracking to demonstrate that Frontex was present. The EU Borders Agency was both present at and aware of, and in some cases complicit in, pushback operations. And that then led to a quite serious fallout with follow-up investigations from Frontex's own management board to the European Parliament to the European Court of Auditors. So even in the most politicized circumstances in which there are malign actors at state and non-state level, where there's heavy disinformation and misinformation, there are approaches that journalists can take in order to provide some basis of facts from which to build coverage and understanding of what's going on. I think that's a reasonable point to wrap up.
Thank you, Daniel, for sharing really very interesting stories and experiences. And it's very interesting that we have really very similar situation here in Lithuania as well. So today, at this moment, you can raise your hands if you have any questions. We have already some questions here, and I would like to start actually from my question to it with this. You mentioned that you are planning to continue, if I understand right, that profiling, or if you are planning to do so, because you said that it's just few campsites that you covered. So what are the continued plans on this?
Yes. So when we was doing this profiling, you know, we had total different situation. We have 30 size locations, distributed people. They were living in very different conditions. Now, when we have all this movement to new locations, now we will have 5-6 locations of the migrants that will be accommodated in reception centers. Now we are in discussion that together with UNHCR, WHO, and the Red Cross to make a joint mission which would deliver much more detailed, you know, situation evaluation, you know, how it's happening, what is the health situation, what about information and counseling services that they're getting, and so on and so on. So now we are waiting until all this movement will end, and then based on that, probably in the upcoming month, we will try to organize some kind of wider mission. Typically, in our case, to have much more, let's say, at least representable survey, it should participate at least 10% of the migrants. You know, that we would say that it's proper enough to make some kind of conclusions. So this is our target.
Okay, thank you. We have one question for Daniel. You already mentioned a little bit about the impact of your investigations and the results released. So the question is, what was the impact of investigation results released? And do you have any tips on how to maximize the impact of evidence that shows human rights violations?
Hi everybody, I'm a colleague of Daniel. Daniel urgently had to go, unless you're there, Dan. I don't think so, no. I can answer his question or the question on his behalf. So with the impact, and to maximize the impact, is also one of the things that we do is to coordinate with strategic litigators, and coordinate, I mean that we can share evidence that we've gathered, that we can consult, or that we discuss with them how to store evidence so that they would be able to use it. And then, of course, if we are asked to present our evidence, for example, for the European Parliament, that we are willing to do that, and working together or share information with organizations across Europe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And yes, and the second question was also for you. If you have any tips for NGOs or mass media as well, representatives, how to effectively engage with the media actors that do not necessarily have a liberal perspective on migration?
Well, one thing that they could do is to help and get a so one of the things that we focus on is helping or to collect visual evidence. So of course, there are many stories around of victims of, for example, violent pushbacks, and these testimonies are very valuable. But it's also it's quite easy for governments to denounce or deny what's going on. And so, yeah, one of the things I would say is to help and get a visual evidence so that we can prove wrongdoings that are going on.
Thank you. And I think that Robert, maybe you can also answer this question. Maybe I will repeat. Do you have any tips for NGOs on how to effectively engage with media actors that do not necessarily have a liberal perspective on migration?
Sorry, was that for me, yeah?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing to think about is what are the objectives and interests and concerns of media in this situation. I mean, like all media are fundamentally businesses, with some exceptions. Some, like Lighthouse, are non-profits, and so they have a model and they're working towards that. They have an audience which have a series of concerns about an array of different things. And I think that one of the key things that you can do is you can actually activate the things that matter to those audiences, that potentially move them in a different direction from where you might go if you just cater to their immediate knee-jerk responses to migration. And I think that a good example of that in the UK context is a thing which you may or may not have come across, which was called the Windrush scandal, which related, now it's not to do with refugees, it's to do with settled migrant communities in the UK, but it relates to the UK's narrative of illegality and efforts to remove, illegal or irregular migrants from the country. And this was driven by a very strong policy, a very aggressive, I should say, policy introduced by the David Cameron administration and Theresa May, which was all about creating a really unpleasant environment for people, which was called the hostile environment, for anybody who was unable to provide evidence of their long-term rights to be in the UK. Now, actually what that meant was that a large number of people who'd come to the UK a very long time ago had fallen into, but had been living here for 30, 40 years, didn't have evidence to prove that they'd arrived as British citizens from former British colonies. Now, I know this is a very specific UK example, but the point is that when the original set of reporting about this issue began to emerge, it was in The Guardian, which is a liberal newspaper. It's kind of exactly where you'd expect to see this kind of thing. To some extent, you might imagine it preaching to the choir. And it had some cut through, it had some impact, the fact that basically the government was removing people and targeting people who had a legal right to be in the UK, but who were unable to prove it. But what subsequently began to happen was that actually this narrative of a lack of fairness, a lack of decency, began to filter into the right-wing press, based on an idea that we were failing in our moral duty, that Britain had always seen itself as being actually a relatively benign colonial power, that it had done good things for the world around it, and that all of the stories about the migrants that lived in the UK were built on the idea that there were good migrants who had helped to build the country, and then there were the bad migrants. And this was targeting the good migrants. Now, we don't like the good migrant, bad migrant binary. And in fact, this began to break it down, because it began to identify that actually the very people that you're identifying as bad migrants are actually the good migrants too. And that in fact, what you're doing is that you are failing, this narrative that you've built your right-wing perspective and your kind of anti-migrant perspective on, which is, well, we're a country of fair play and decency, and we play, we do things reasonably and kindly and in a moderate and thoughtful way. But if people don't abide by the rules, we boot them out, which was the story that the right-wing press had consistently reinforced. That fell apart. And in fact, that created a huge and angry backlash from the right-wing press, because they felt abandoned and let down by the government that had given them this kind of narrative, that had fed them this story. We're just playing by the rules. We want people to play by the rules. And in fact, what they were doing was not playing by the rules. And it led to the resignation of the Home Secretary. It almost brought down the Conservative Prime Minister, who was Theresa May at that point in time. It was front page news in the press. So it's a question of capturing the kind of the moral and ethical positions of the people that the media is speaking to on something different. So it wasn't really talking about immigration specifically or migration as an issue. It was capturing the fact that decency is not limited to treating, like the other, it's not limited to your own immediate community. Decency is something which people generally feel they should extend to those around them if they treat them reasonably, if they're kind, if they're reasonable, if they're good people and contribute to society. So that sort of thing can be easily activated, something which basically says what is the moral position of the average Lithuanian, or of the right-wing reader of a Lithuanian newspaper or watcher of a Lithuanian TV program. What are the things that they'd be angry about? And I think that being decent is a universal desire. Very few people want to be hideous and brutal. Nobody, I mean, the Aylan Kurdi photograph from back in the day, which is controversial in a lot of different ways, and the kinds of images that Lighthouse have been showing here, these are images that highlight hypocrisy, failure, cruelty. And those are things that nobody wants to be associated with. And only a very, very hardcore of people will be willing to accept that kind of brutality as something that actually is a price that's worth paying for maintaining a kind of, you know, a non-migrant society. So I think that the key is finding those spaces within the kind of the moral perception of individuals that you're dealing with, particularly those individuals that are dealing with that are consuming that kind of non-liberal, the conservative media, and not exploiting, that's the wrong way of putting it, making sure that people are thinking in those terms about the realities that you're highlighting for people. So it's a little bit, I mean, it's a little, essentially, I mean, this is the point about, it's about persuasion. And like the challenge that we have in the world now is that there are powers, there are multiple powers fighting to persuade audiences of things. And we have to work out how we can persuade people of our perspectives on stuff. And I know that seems like an obvious statement, but it requires us to think about what they want, what they need, what they care about.
Thank you. We have very similar question to what to the discussion what you already talked about, but I know that Eitvydas will have to leave soon, so I will read the question that we have to you, and then we can continue a bit more. So Yusuf was asking about how would you assess the treatment of refugees who are still kept inside iron fences and treated like criminals?
It's a sensitive question. I think one of the things I think which is very important, you know, to understand that what is happening now in Lithuania is under Lithuanian law. So, you know, in one hand we can say it's reasonable, or maybe it's legal. On the other side, we should keep in mind that there is regional and international law, which we should also, you know, as a state, we have some kind of commitment that we should follow, especially when we are talking about the human rights. So the technical thing that at the moment we still didn't make any kind of site assessment because of this current situation. But what our organization is articulating quite clear, that detention, especially of vulnerable groups and the children, it's behind of the human rights perspective, especially for the migrants. And definitely, I hope, you know, I understand on one hand that the government is quite careful, sensitive about the issues, how to handle them. But I think that, you know, with a certain period of time, they will become more flexible, trusted, and they will start doing some new additional activities. What we are trying to also to advocate to deliver some kind of at least mid-run or mid-solutions in short term, like so-called alternative to detention, especially for vulnerable groups, you know, just to getting used to, you know, new approaches. But on the other hand, before all this crisis in Lithuania, all the migrants, they were not, you know, detained and so on. So this is probably the reaction to increased numbers of migrants. But I think in the mid-run, long run, government become much more flexible on this issue. I hope, at least.
Thank you. And in general, when we are talking about the migrants in Lithuania, not only the ones that already are detained in the camps, we see them more as some kind of threat rather than trying to find some positive sides of migration. And here's the question. First of all, it was the question about what is the current situation of refugees in Lithuania and whether they pose a threat to national security. And maybe I would like to ask Rob, or as well as Daniel, how would you respond to the idea that refugees do pose a threat to national security, and how we can know to present it in publicly and trying to, I don't know, to make a bit like situation more positive than it is, no, I mean, the narratives.
Okay, it's the big challenge with this is that you only need one person to be a problem for there to be a narrative that says that people represent a fundamental threat to national security. And it's very, very hard to disprove something. I mean, it's hard to demonstrate an absence of something. You know, I mean, how can you do that? What we can say is that in the UK context, for example, where we have vastly greater numbers of refugees and asylum seekers than Lithuania, it is extraordinarily rare that those people have actually represented a threat to national security. Now, that's not to say it's never happened, because it also slightly depends on what we mean by national security. But the majority of incidents that have involved attacks on individuals or anything like that have actually been from people who are long-standing UK residents. They're not from refugees and asylum seekers. Broadly speaking, refugees and asylum seekers are enormously valuable members of society. But the problem is that, I mean, you can't, it is a challenge. I mean, it's what I was trying to talk about right at the beginning. It's easy to create a bogeyman because you can say, what if, you know? But the problem is that there's no evidence. Where is it? I mean, you have to say, where is the evidence that these people are a threat first, rather than saying there's the possibility that they might be. Well, I mean, we had a mass shooting in the UK about 3 or 4 weeks ago. The guy was just was a white British builder who was, as far as we can make out, unhappy that he couldn't find a girlfriend. You know, that's a threat to national security. Does that mean that we should you know, incarcerate all young and sort of sexually frustrated young white boys? Of course not. It's preposterous. The challenge is that this kind of othering of a group because they're arriving, and the idea that we should be able to protect our borders means that we end up in a situation where people construct as many different ways of arguing that this is a problem as they can find. So I think there's very little evidence, but it's also, as I say, it's almost impossible to prove an absence of something. You know, how do we know what someone's thinking in their head? We can't possibly know that. So it's very, very challenging to do, other than to highlight the lack of evidence across the world of these scenarios. But even in that case, you end up participating in this debate again and again and again. You end up referring back again and again and again to issues of national security. Whereas the primary risk, I would say, to national security in a place like Lithuania is not some kind of jihadi terrorist, but is actually the geopolitical use of fear within the country. And that is where I think that the debate needs to go. That deliberate exploitation of fear of the other is what terrorism in fact is all about. You know, creating a sense that there might be a risk, yeah? And if the Lithuanian government and media persists in a securitization narrative about this kind of thing, they actually do the job of those geopolitical actors who are trying to instill fear in the nation. So that, I think, is really the only thing that can be really, I mean, that's a specific known quantity thing that you can push back against. Why are we allowing ourselves to replicate and amplify the narrative of effectively global terrorism? And that global terrorism is not from jihadis, it's from state actors. I think Daniel wanted to say something.
Yes, please, Daniel. Yes, please.
I'm going to put things in just to reinforce a little bit what Rob is saying. Of course, there are these narratives that come up, and in thinking about how to respond to them, I think it's useful to think why, if there are state actors that understand the vulnerability of European societies on issues like this, what are they driving at? Why does Turkey, which has its own strategy, why does it see Greece as tremendously vulnerable? And why does it see this as an area to pressure? And because that kind of thinking, I think, can succeed in conversation with people who are otherwise going to buy immediately into narratives of threat. It's a very simple thing. You're being manipulated. You're being pushed towards responding in a particular way. So in the context here, if you want to take the most cynical line in this, what is it that Lukashenko or Putin are pushing for in Lithuania? What do they want to see? And what they want to see is not open borders and multicultural Lithuania. They want to see, and this is not why there's some kind of facilitation going on at the movement of people, any more than Turkey wants to see a dynamic labor market and interesting responses in Greece. They want to see panic. They want to see a militarized response. They want polarization. So I do think you can apply the brakes a little bit just by explaining to people you're being pushed into a situation. You've got outside forces who you recognize as not having your best interests at heart. What are they pushing for? This is what they're pushing for. They're trying to create a situation in which they can draw a false equivalence between their human rights abuses, the situation in their countries, and the situation within the European Union. So the most foolish thing is to move directly towards doing that. And this is in the kind of what British people like Rob and myself might call kind of the pub conversation about this. This is what you're trying to avoid. You're trying to avoid being incredibly predictable in your response. There is no way to make the narratives of inclusion and human rights and rule of law as compelling as the simplistic narratives of others and threat. There's just no way to compete. But I do think in the pub conversation, you can get people to stop and think by telling them that they're allowing themselves to be manipulated and pushed into a corner. Their predictable response is the response that's being looked for from the other side.
Thank you, Daniel. We have one more question. Well, I don't know, actually, it's probably also related to the Lithuanian language, but I will read it and later on we'll see if we can answer it or not. There's a big debate about the vocabulary used. Some say they should not be called migrants, more so illegal, but rather refugees. Can someone advise about the difference? I don't know, Rob or Daniel, would you be able to respond?
Okay, well, the first thing that I would suggest is that if you look up the comment section, the chat section a little bit, you'll see a link through to the Handbook on Migration Reporting, which I mentioned in my in my chat earlier on, which contains a glossary of terminology and an explanation of the different kinds of uses and problems associated with different language. That's been carefully reviewed by a number of academic and human rights focused specialists, as well as by journalists and people who actually are working in this area and actually need to find quick and direct ways of discussing stuff. So the first thing I would say is, terminology like illegal is very, very problematic. Especially if you're defining people whose claim for asylum has not been assessed at this point in time, you should absolutely, under no circumstances, be referring to them as illegal, because if they're claiming asylum, they are legally present. The question of crossing a border and national laws about borders, this is slightly different, it's slightly complicated, but at the end of the day, there are a vast number of scenarios in which it's considered to be basically inescapable that in order to claim asylum, you have to break some national laws in order to enter a safe country. So I think that this is all explained in some detail in that. So I think, firstly, the term illegal, especially when dealing with asylum seekers, is very problematic. Even describing people as being illegal immigrants, if they are resident without permission, is significantly problematized by, for example, the issue of Windrush, which I mentioned earlier on, where people were unable to prove their legal status, but actually they were legally resident in the UK. But even so, I mean, it's also considered to be a dehumanizing word, that it basically says this isn't a person, it's an illegal. And I think that automatically creates a scenario that says, well, we don't need to treat them as a human being, and that is very problematic. So it's highly advised you don't use that terminology. The term migrants is very complicated because the problem with any word is that it can acquire loading. When I first started working on this issue, the term migrant was broadly considered to be the kind of the sort of neutral, non-loaded term. But throughout, particularly the 2014, 15, 16 migration crisis that affected Europe, the term migrant began to be used to differentiate essentially economic migrants who were not perceived to have a justifiable claim for asylum from legitimate asylum seekers, broadly from Syria at that point in time. Now, I don't see a problem with the term migrant. I think it depends on how you use it, and it sometimes requires a little bit of clarity. But from my point of view, it's not a problem, but it can be used problematically. I mean, it's the same as any word. If you point at someone and say, you migrant, that's offensive. You know, because it's clearly being used with a desire to generate a sense of difference. Now, at the end of the day, how you use terminology as a journalist is going to be a matter for your own conscience to some extent. But I think that there are things that you can do to actually identify individuals as individuals. You can talk about so-and-so who was born in such and such a country rather than describing them as migrant. You can do all kinds of things to get around that kind of thing, but sometimes you have to use shorthand in order to basically be able to do things in the way that you need to in the time limits that you have or in the word limits that you have. The point is always to think about it and consider how it may be read. As I say, have a look at the glossary of terminology that's in my handbook, and you can make your own choices about these kinds of things anyway. I mean, obviously you can make your own choices about these things anyway, but it's about, think about whether or not there may be perceived loading in this terminology. And when I say loading, I mean loading it with additional meaning or a sort of political perspective. But yeah, I mean, there's no right or wrong way of doing these things, but I think that you can apply certain rules, which, for example, not dehumanizing people with the language that you use.
Daniel, you would like to add?
Yeah, I'll just be very brief because broadly speaking, I agree with what Rob said. Just to commend this being mindful of the language that you use. I would say to journalists as an exercise, write what you're going to write the piece, and then go back through it and see how many times you can remove the word refugee or migrant and replace it with the word person, people, with people's nationality. It's a really useful exercise in understanding the weight of these words. Going back to 2015, 2016, there was a distinct moment in international coverage of the movement of people across the Eastern Aegean. And it was a moment in which journalists, for very understandable reasons, wanted to communicate the sense of this being a refugee crisis by beginning to stop talking about migrants and begin to refer to people as refugees. And at the time, I felt quite supportive of that, and I certainly understood where the instinct came from. They wanted to communicate the fact that this really was a refugee crisis in the way that that most societies would think about it. But it has left us 5 years later with a very direct opposition between deserving refugees and undeserving migrants. And we are in bad need of rehabilitating the word migrant. It's a long-term knock-on effect from that period. Academics are quite hard taskmasters for journalists in terms of they would like the terminology around this to correspond exactly with the categorizations that they afford. And in writing for a general audience, that's really quite hard sometimes. So I would commend that exercise of just writing things in the way that you would normally, and then go back through it and see how many of the references to people you could, how many times you could use different language and more humanizing language. As I think it would be quite a surprise to people, and give a little bit of space even in the kind of busy reporting life to thinking about not getting pulled into this trap of there being deserving refugees and somehow threatening undeserving, cheating migrants, because that's an opposition which has absolutely no winners and does nothing for accuracy of reporting.
Thank you, Daniel. We still have some questions coming, but I know that Rob have to leave. So I don't know, probably I will just say goodbye for Rob, and still we'll have the last question for Daniel on this, and then we will wrap up. Thank you, Rob, for joining us today. So yeah, the last question then will be, I think it's related with a question that Yusuf have also posted in the chat. Well, in Lithuania, journalists has like a limited access and access to information what's happening in the border, and also we are a lot of restrictions to entering into the border and to provide information. So the question is, what measures would you propose to take to ensure that they receive objective information from your practice in such cases? We can't hear you. You are muted. Okay.
In our case, so immediately following the crisis that I described last year, we found ourselves in a situation in which people who crossed the border weren't being allowed into the asylum system and were being transferred to detention camps that we couldn't access. Then the COVID crisis struck, and that was a perfect excuse to prevent any movement of journalists and direct contact with people who were in the camps. What I would say to journalists is that almost everybody who's on the move is communicating and has a presence on social media. There are ways that you can look for Facebook groups, Facebook activity, Twitter groups, Twitter activity, and you can establish digital connection with one or two people inside these facilities, however closely guarded they are. So there are ways for journalists to use social media to establish contact with people inside these situations, and it's well worth doing so. So sometimes when you can't physically pass the barriers, you can use the digital tools to remove the barriers entirely and find ways to reach out and speak to them. If it's a language issue, very often there are people from the same communities who would work with journalists very willingly and affordably to try and help them translate conversations and gather sources. Now, verifying what people are saying to you about conditions inside camps or their treatment, etc. This is something that we've had to get very good at over a period of time. We do encourage people to share images and to share video with us, share things that we can then verify. We can ensure that they are from the right location, they were taken at the time that they say. But we found that through these techniques, we can establish multiple sources inside even the most closely guarded detention camps, speak to them in more detail and get their view of what's going on. Obviously, you also need to speak to government officials and speak to national agencies to get their view, but the job of the journalist is to develop sources and to get information from both sides, even when there are barriers being put in your way to prevent you doing that. I would encourage people to take a look around Lighthouse's site, where we talk a little bit about the techniques that we've used to access sources in detention settings or in camp settings where they're not allowed out.
Thank you, Daniel. I think that your questions and a lot of questions that we received just show how it is relevant, important to talk about it and how sensitive issue is in Lithuania at the moment. Unfortunately, but we have to wrap up. I do hope that all this discussion and the questions that we raised were practical and you will use it in practice. If you have still more questions, I don't know, you can contact also DDG and we can think about follow-on activities and how we can continue this conversation that we started today. So thank you very much, Daniel, that you joined and for your time being here. It was really very nice to hear your experience. Thanks and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.